Hi candidates, welcome to another session of manifested online classes. So in this session, I want us we continue with the topic on impairment of asset. So in our previous class, we discussed or we defined what is an impairment, when an asset is deemed to be impaired, those particular factors which shows that the asset could be impaired. And also we did an illustration question as far as the determination of impairment loss is concerned. So in this session, I want us to look on what is a cash generating unit in accordance with IS 36, and how do we determine the impairment loss of a cash generating unit, and how is such impairment loss allocated to those particular assets within a cash generating asset. So first of all, we'll talk about cash generating unit, which is abbreviated as CGU. This refers to a group of assets which generate cash flow as a group. Basically, what that means is that if you pick one of the assets from that particular group of assets, that asset cannot be able to generate cash flow on its own. A good example is something like a factory. So a factory, we know, do have a number of assets. We have the factory building. We have the machines which are installed within the factory. We also have computers maybe for record keeping. We also have some tractors which work in the factory for transporting the raw materials maybe from point A to point B and so on. So therefore, a factory is basically a cash generating unit. It's basically a group of assets which generate cash flow as what? As a group. What that means, therefore, is that if you pick one of the assets from that particular group, it cannot be able to generate cash flow on its what? On its own. As we are going to see later on, in determining now the impairment loss of a cash generating unit, we determine the impairment loss of the entire group of assets and not the impairment loss of the asset within what? Within that particular CGU. But before we do that, let's first of all define what is a cash generating unit or a CGU. And I've said that this is a smallest identifiable group of assets, assets that generate cash flows, that are largely independent from cash flows generated by other assets, or group of assets, So that is the definition of a cash generating unit. Now, what you have said is that when it comes to determining the impairment loss of this particular cash generating unit, we have said that we determine the impairment loss of the cash generating asset, not the impairment loss of individual asset within what? Such a group of assets, simply because you have said that this particular asset here, they generate cash flow as a group. And it is also important for you to recall, for you to be able to determine the impairment loss of an asset, there is something you need to determine or to compute known as the value in use. We compute the value in use or the recoverable amount of an asset using the cash flows which are generated by the asset. And due to the fact that individual assets do not generate cash flow on their own, it is not therefore possible to do what? To determine the impairment loss of individual asset within that group. But what you're saying, we determine the impairment loss of what? Of the entire cash generating asset. So therefore, we can say that it is not possible to determine a recoverable amount of individual assets, within the cash generating unit. I've explained the reason why this is the case. We are saying if, for example, we have a group of assets, we can take, for example, a factory. Factory, we have said, comprises of a number of assets. We have the machines in that factory. We also have things like the patent. The patent is that innovation used by the company in terms of producing various products. We also have things like computer equipment. We also have things like what? Motor vehicles, which work within that factory and so on. So therefore, we are saying that this is a good example of what? A cash generating unit. So this particular asset here generate cash flow as a group, meaning that if, for example, you pick one asset from this particular group, like maybe you pick something like machines, these machines cannot be able to generate cash flow on their own, and therefore it is not possible to determine the recoverable amount of that particular what? Machine. Because for you to determine the recoverable amount of the machine, there is something which you need, and that is the cash flows generated by that machine. We are saying the machine itself cannot or do not generate cash flow on its own. The cash flow which is generated, it is generated by all these particular assets as what? As a group. That's why we are saying it is not possible to determine what? The recoverable amount of individual asset within what? The cash generating what? Unit. So instead now what we do, we determine the recoverable amount of the cash generating unit, and further we go ahead and determine the impairment loss equally of the cash generating what? Unit. So therefore we can say thus the recoverable amount of the CGU is determined, which is then used in computing impairment loss, of the cash generating what? Unit. So therefore, once we have a group of assets which generate cash flow as a group, we are saying it is not possible for you to determine the impairment loss of individual asset here, but what you do, you determine the impairment loss of the group of assets. You determine the impairment loss of the cash generating unit. Now, once the impairment loss of this cash generating unit has been determined, and actually this impairment loss of a cash generating unit is determined in the same way, just like how we determine the impairment loss of individual asset. Maybe you can just remind ourselves about on how we compute the impairment loss. So the impairment loss is equal to the carrying amount minus the recoverable amount. The recoverable amount, and equally you have to recall that the recoverable amount here, we said this is the higher over two values. Number one, the value in use, or number two, the net realizable value or fair value less cost to sell. So therefore, in terms of how we determine the impairment loss of a cash generating unit, we use the same approach, the same formula for determining the impairment loss for individual what? Asset. Now, this particular impairment loss for the cash generating unit, then we are saying should be allocated to the asset within that particular cash generating unit. And in doing that particular allocation, in allocating the impairment loss, there is the order which is followed. So therefore, you can say the impairment loss for the CGU cash generating unit is allocated to the assets within the CGU in the following order. in the following order. So number one, we allocate to those particular assets which are obviously impaired. Number one, to asset obviously impaired. Assets obviously impaired. And when talk about assets which are obviously impaired, these are assets which are damaged, asset damaged, or the asset which are destroyed, which are destroyed, the asset which are destroyed. So basically what that means is that if the company decide to sell this particular cash generating unit, then that particular asset which is obviously impaired will not fetch any amount of money because it is damaged, or basically it is what? Destroyed. Number two, we allocate impairment loss to the goodwill, in the cash generating unit or in the CGU. And number three, we allocate to other assets. Allocate to other assets, to other assets, on pro rata basis, i.e. based on the carrying amount, or the net book value. So any impairment loss now will be allocated to the other asset other than goodwill, other than those particular assets which are obviously impaired, and that should be done in accordance with the net book value. In this case, we have said to other assets on pro rata basis. It is also important here to know that when allocating this particular impairment loss, the value of the asset should not be reduced below the higher of the three values. Below the higher of three what? Values. So therefore, we can say in allocating the impairment loss, the value of an asset should not be reduced below the higher of three values. Number one, 0. Number two, the net realizable value of the asset. And number three, the value in use if it is determinable. If it is what? Determinable. Remember, in this case, in determining the value in use of an asset, we use the cash flows. We discount the cash flows to be generated by such an asset. But we are saying assets which are within a CGU, asset which generate cash flow as a group, then it is not possible to determine the cash flow generated by individual assets, because those are assets, they are generate cash flow as what? As a group. So individual asset cannot be able to generate cash flow on its own. And therefore, in most of the cases, it is not possible to determine its value in use. So therefore, once you have allocated the impairment loss, then make sure that the value of the asset is not reducing below the higher of 0, net realizable value, or the value in use. So therefore, that is what is important for you to know. You need to know what is a cash generating unit. How do we determine the impairment loss of the cash generating unit? And equally, how do we allocate that particular impairment loss to those particular assets within the cash generating unit? And basically, I've said that is the order which is followed. To the asset which have obviously impaired, to the goodwill, and basically to the other asset in that cash generating unit on a pro rata basis. So I want us to do an illustration as far as this is concerned, and the illustration question I want us to do is a question which was tested in the sitting of August of 2022, and then at the end of this lesson I will give some assignment on the same. So let's look on that question. So this is a question for August of 2022. Question number 2A. So the question reads, B Limited operate a factory as its sole cash generating unit. During the year which ended 30th of April 2022, there was an explosion in the factory which necessitated an impairment review. So basically what that means that at the end of the year 2022, there was some evidence which showed that this cash generating unit could be impaired, and therefore there was a need to carry out impairment review. So we are given the carrying amount of the factory asset, which were as follows. So we have goodwill, and the carrying amount was 2 million, patent 3.6 million, machine 4 million, computer equipment 8 million, premises 30 million. The total carrying amount is 47.6 million. Then we have some additional information. Number one, we are told an impairment review or an impairment review revealed a net selling price of shillings 19.2 million and a value in use of 31.2 for the factory. 2, half of the machine have been destroyed and have no resale value. Number 3, the patent have been superseded and are now considered valueless. And number 4, we are told the company follow the cost model as permitted by International Accounting Standard number 16, that is which deals with the PPE. So what that means that the property, plant and equipment which are owned by this company, they are accounted for using the cost model. Remember what you have said is that if the company is accounting for its assets using the cost model, then the full amount of impairment loss should be deducted from the value of the asset. Should be deducted from the value of the asset. That is the implication, or basically the importance of that particular point. So what you're required is to discuss with suitable calculations how any impairment loss in the cash generating unit CGU would be accounted for in accordance with what? International Accounting Standard number 36. So we are required to discuss with suitable calculations. So basically what you needed to say here is that this company, that is B Limited, will need to carry out impairment review, or basically we need to determine the impairment loss of this cash generating unit and then proceed to allocate it to the asset within that particular cash generating unit. And actually we have discussed on the order to be followed by the company in allocating that particular impairment loss. So therefore, before we can determine the impairment loss, we can say that on 30th of April 2022, which is now the end of the year, B Limited must do what? Must carry out impairment review, and any impairment loss should be allocated to the asset within the CGU, within the cash generating unit, in the following order. One, we have said impairment loss should be allocated to assets which are obviously impaired. Number 2, we allocate to the goodwill within that cash generating unit. And finally, to other assets. other asset on pro rata basis. On pro rata basis means that when allocating now the impairment loss to the other asset within the CGU, we allocate that particular impairment loss based on the net book value of the other assets. The net book value, remember, is the same with what? The carrying amount. That's the first thing you needed to say. And then from there, you proceed, you determine the impairment loss. For you to do that, you must have the formula of determining the impairment loss, which is the carrying amount minus recoverable amount. So we need to have these two values, carrying amount and the recoverable amount of the cash generating unit. So the carrying amount, remember, is the same with the net book value because the examiner may give you the net book value instead of the carrying amount. And we already given that amount under paragraph 2 of this cash generating unit, which is given as 47,600 million. So that figure is already given. Then we have that we need next to determine the recoverable amount. And the recoverable amount, we have said that this is taken to be the higher, or we take this to be the higher of two values. Number one, the value in use, of which the value in use is given in the additional information number 1. We are told the value in use was 200 million. 200 million shillings. 200 million. So we take that all Roman 2, the net realizable value. The net realizable value, in other terms, is the fair value less cost to sell. And this is what in the additional information number 1 is given as the net selling price. The net selling what? Price. Because when we talk about the net selling price, this is the amount now which the company will receive after selling the asset minus any cost which will be incurred by the company in selling that what? Asset. And this is given as 19,200 million. 19,200 million. So what we need to do, out of the two figures, we need to take the figure which is higher. Automatically, that will be that 1.2 million, and that will be the recoverable amount. So therefore, you can say our recoverable amount, is shillings 31,200 million. 200 million. So having this value here, having the recoverable amount and the carrying amount, so what we need to do is to determine whether our cash generating unit is impaired. Remember, generally we have said an asset or even a cash generating unit will be deemed to be impaired when the recoverable amount is less than the carrying amount. So in our case, we know the recoverable amount is 31,200 million. What about the carrying amount? It is 47,600 million. So we need to check, is our recoverable amount less? Is this less than that one? Yes, it is. If that is the case, then we say that our asset here is what? Is impaired. Not the asset, rather, our cash generating unit is what? Is impaired. And therefore, what we need to do, we need to proceed and we determine the impairment loss. The impairment loss, we use our formula up here. We take the carrying amount, which is 47,600 million, minus the recoverable amount, which we already have here, 31,200 million. So we get the difference here, which now will be what? Which will be the impairment loss. So we have 47,600 minus 31,200. Okay, we can take that again. 47,600 minus 31,200. So that will give us a impairment loss of shillings 16,400 million. 400 million. So what we need to do now is to proceed and allocate this impairment loss to the asset within that particular cash generating unit. So we need to do the allocation of that impairment loss. So we have allocation of impairment loss. Allocation of impairment loss. So remember what we said is that in allocating this particular impairment loss, this is the order which we follow. One, we allocate to those assets which are obviously impaired. Then we allocate to the goodwill. And finally, we allocate to the other asset based on their carrying amount. So there is some information which you are given in this particular question here. Let's go to the additional information number 2. We are told half of the machine have been destroyed and therefore they have no resale value. So any asset which do not have a resale value, such asset is obviously impaired. Is obviously impaired because you have said assets which are obviously impaired are those assets which are destroyed, or basically those assets which are fully damaged. So therefore, number 1, we are going to allocate to machine, and basically not all the machine. We are told half of the machine. Half of the machine. And if you go back to the information we have under paragraph 2, the machine have a carrying amount of 4 million. 4 million. 4 million. It is important to note that these figures here are in thousand of shillings. These figures are in thousand of shillings. So therefore, these will not necessarily be millions. Yes, because our figures are in thousand of shillings. Yes, so let's do away with the million here. Let's do away with the million here. Yes, but we need to know all our figures here are in thousand of what? In thousand of shillings. Yes. So first of all, you're going to allocate to the machines, not all the machines, but half. So machines, they have a value of 4 million. So what is half of 4 million? Half of 4 million is 2 million. So therefore, because those machines are fully impaired, we are going to allocate an impairment loss equivalent to their carrying amount, which is 2 million, such that once you have allocated that impairment loss of 2 million, we are going to reduce the carrying amount of 2 million with 2 million. And that means that the value of those machines after allocating the impairment loss will be 0. Will be what? 0. So basically, it means that the other machines, and that is half of the other machines, or half of 4 million, those machines are not obviously impaired. So then there is also another information we have in note number 3, that patent, which is one of the assets within that CGU, have been superseded and are now considered valueless. So when talk about patent, a patent is basically an innovation which is used in the factory in terms of producing various products. So if you are told it is superseded, it means that it has been replaced by a new patent, and therefore it is considered to be valueless, meaning that such asset is also considered to be fully what? Impaired. So if the company decides to sell this CGU, that patent will not fetch any amount of money. So therefore, next we allocate to the other asset which is obviously impaired, and that is what? Patent. And in this case, we are going to allocate impairment loss of how much? That is 6. Remember, our total impairment loss is 16.4. So therefore, in allocating this impairment loss, always you must remember how much is the impairment loss. You can see to this machine, we have allocated impairment loss of 2 million. So meaning that out of the total impairment loss, we have an impairment loss which is remaining of 14.4. So we then allocate now an impairment loss to patent of how much? That is 6. Still, our impairment loss is remaining. Then we have allocated out to the assets which are obviously impaired. So these are assets obviously impaired. obviously impaired. So next, we allocate now to the goodwill. We allocate to the goodwill within that cash generating asset. So the value of goodwill is what? Is 2 million. Can we be able to allocate a full amount of 2 million? Yes, because remember our impairment loss 16.4. To the machine, we have allocated 2 million. To the patent, we have allocated what? 36. So mean that the remaining impairment loss is in excess of 10 million. So therefore, to the goodwill, we are going to allocate the full amount of what? 2 million. Yes, so that is goodwill. And then finally, we allocate now to the other asset within that CGU. So which are those other assets? Which are those other assets? We can just list them here. Other assets. These include, from the list which you have provided under paragraph 2, we have allocated to the goodwill, we have allocated impairment loss to the patent, and then we have now the machine. We can talk of the other machines. Remember, the machines which were fully impaired here were half. So the other machines will be having a net book value of what? A net book value of 2 million, or a carrying amount of 2 million. So and then below that we have computer equipment. We have not allocated any impairment loss to those computer equipment. The net book value or carrying amount is what? Is 8. And then we have a premises. A premises whose value is 30. So mean that the total carrying amount of these three assets is what? Is 40. So why do we need this particular value here? We need that particular value because we are going to allocate now the remaining impairment loss to those three assets based on their carrying what? Based on their carrying amount. So therefore, what we need to do, we need to determine the impairment loss now to be allocated to these three assets. So how do we determine that? So the first thing we need to do is to determine how much impairment loss was allocated to machine, or the total impairment loss allocated to this machine which were destroyed, patent and what? And goodwill. And this will give us 4 million. Meaning that that will come to a total of 36 plus 4,000. That will come to a total of what? Of 76. So mean that the total impairment loss which is here to be allocated will be equal to the total impairment loss minus the impairment loss which has been allocated to these three assets, 76, and the remaining impairment loss will be what? Will be 800. So, or 8.8. So this impairment loss will be allocated to these three assets based on their net book value, based on their carrying amount. So to determine the amount to be allocated to other machines, we take its carrying amount, which is 2 million, all over the total impairment, all over the total carrying amount of the three assets, which is 40 million, times the impairment loss to be allocated to the three assets. We do the same for computer equipment, 8 million, all over the total impairment, all over the total carrying amount, 40 million, times 800, and finally to premises, 30 million, all over 40 million, times 800. So this will give us the impairment loss to be allocated to those three assets. So to the other machine, we have 2 out of 40 times 800, and that will give us for 40. Remember also these figures are in thousands of shillings. What about to computer equipment? We have 8 all over 40 times 88, and that will give us 1760. And then finally to what? To premises, 30 divided by 40 times 800. So which will give us 66. So that is now the impairment loss to be allocated to other machines, computer equipment, and the premises. So that is it. That basically what was required as far as that particular question was concerned. And basically by determining this particular impairment loss, and then proceeding to allocate it now to these other assets, then by doing that, you could have gotten now the allocated 10 what? 10 marks. So that bring us now to the end of that particular topic regarding the determination of impairment loss in accordance with the International Accounting Standard number 36. But before we end our class, I want to give some assignment. These are some questions from the past papers. Make sure you attempt those questions. We have 2 other questions on this. So the first question is for September 2021, question 5B. So this question was requiring the computation of impairment loss for 2 cash generating units. And then we have another question for December 2023, which is question number 1C. Question number 1C. So make sure you attempt those 2 questions. 2 questions. And equally, if you have a challenge in terms of answering those questions, I always usually encourage my students to acquire this revision partner. All those particular questions are here. The questions are here, and also the solutions for those particular questions are at the end of this particular book. So if you have a challenge in terms of answering those particular questions, make sure you get this revision partner, which is basically available at a very affordable rate. So therefore, we come to an end, or basically that is the end of that particular session. So see you in the next class as we look on the other subtopic.